Well, you got your soil test back, and now you're wondering what to do with the results. Sometimes when you look at it, it can be kind of intimidating, and if you've never looked at one before, you may not even know where to start. So what I'm going to hope to do with this video is answer a few of those questions and kind of walk you through what I look at when I get my soil test back and how I approach using those results going forward in my next year of fertilization and maintenance on my yard. So one of the reasons that I like to get a soil test as opposed to just feeding the grass is it gives you a starting point for where your nutrients are and gives you the ability to correct the deficiencies and also to correct your pH to make those nutrients that are actually in your soil more available. One example on why to get a soil test that they highlighted on some of their information is if you have a soil that's very deficient in a nutrient, so take phosphorus or potassium for example, as you apply that in a fertilizer form throughout the year, you may get very little of that fertilizer into the growth of your turf, and a lot of it may be going into the soil bank to where it's trying to replenish that depletion in nutrients. Another example is pH is impossible to determine otherwise without getting a soil test, and that is one of your most important factors that we'll talk about for the release of your nutrients. So I'm just going to go to the screen and show you what my soil test is, and we'll walk through and look at the different nutrients that I have and how I'm going to go about correcting it. The first thing I look at when I get my soil test results back is the soil pH. You can see mine's a 6.0. Optimum is going to be around a 6.5. When I first started growing turf in my front yard 3 or 4 years ago, I was around a 4.8, and it's taken quite a few tons of lime to get it up to that 6.0. A lot of people don't realize how many tons of lime per acre it takes to get your soil pH up to optimum when it's that low. Your soil pH is important because it's going to regulate the amount of nutrients that are available and unavailable to the plant. As you can see by this nutrient availability chart, the different nutrients that become available and unavailable at certain pHs. And as you can see, that 6.5 range is pretty optimal. If you look down at the fertilizer recommendations in pounds per 1,000 square feet at the bottom, Spectrum Analytic is recommending 20 pounds of lime, 20 pounds of calcitic lime specifically per 1,000 square feet to get my pH up into that optimal range. One thing to keep in mind about soil pH as well is not everybody needs lime. If your soil pH is above 7, then you'll need to be applying elemental sulfur or citric acid or something along those lines to get it down below 7. Soil pH is also a constant battle, so it will continually try to revert back to what it was before you started applying your lime or sulfur, depending on which way you're moving it. And it will be a continual maintenance process of keeping your soil pH corrected. And the next column over there is the buffer pH of 6.7. That's just a value that the lab uses to come up with that recommended lime application rate at the bottom of the page to get your soil pH up to optimum. That buffer pH is affected a lot by your CECs and organic matter in your soil. So the lower that buffer pH is, the more lime it takes to actually move your soil pH up or down a point. Moving on to the phosphorus under pounds per acre available nutrient, you see I have an 18. In ppm, that would be a 9, which is severely deficient in phosphorus. So that is something I will be working on correcting this year. And if you go down to the bottom under fertilizer recommendation in pounds per 1,000 square foot, it's recommended almost 5 pounds of phosphorus per 1,000 square foot over the course of the next growing season, which is probably a lot more than I will put out this year. And I definitely would not recommend putting that out in one application or probably even two. That would probably be a 3 to 4 application rate. So the next column you see is the potassium under the K, 234 pounds per acre. So that's about 117 parts per million. I would say that's good. And if you come down to the bar graph right below it, you do see that it's adequate. Fertilizer recommendations per 1,000 square foot under potassium, it is saying about 1 pound per 1,000 square foot of potassium. So while we're talking about these fertilizer recommendations in pounds per 1,000 square foot, Spectrum Analytic comes up with these recommendations based on how much the soil is deficient in that nutrient, plus how much the plant is going to be using throughout that year based on the nitrogen that you're giving it. So if you look at the nitrogen feeding recommendation of 2 to 3 pounds per 1,000 square foot, you would suspect that the potassium would be about 1 pound per 1,000 square foot, because usually potassium is taken up at half the rate of the nitrogen that you give it. So if you want to increase your potassium a little bit, usually you're going slightly higher than a 2 to 1 ratio on your nitrogen and potassium. One way to lower these nutrients is to remove your clippings when you mow. So keep in mind that if you do remove your clippings, that you will need to increase your input. So moving on to your next two columns, calcium, magnesium, you can kind of talk about those together. You can see here mine is 1618 to 394, so about 4 to 1. So that's one reason that they're recommending calcitic type lime in the 20 pounds per 1,000 square foot of lime recommendation at the bottom to get my calcium levels just slightly higher than what they are compared to the magnesium. But overall, those two levels are showing adequate per the bar graph down below. At one time, they wanted the calcium to magnesium ratio to be close to 7 to 1, but I think they found over the years that turf does well over a wide range of the calcium to magnesium ratios. I would worry about is if I had an inverted ratio and the magnesium number was greater than calcium. The next column is going to be your soil CECs. That's probably one of the most overlooked columns on a soil test, and it is important to know what your soil CEC is. That's going to tell how many nutrients your soil can hold. So mine is an 8.3, which would be indicative of a sandy type soil. So what you can use that information for is how you build your fertilizer program in terms of volume and frequency. So the higher your CEC is, the more your soil has the ability to hold the nutrients that you give it. In a lower CEC, you could be prone to leaching some of your nutrients out if you give it heavy doses at one time. So instead of giving it a heavy spring and summertime feeding on zoysia grass, what I like to do is do monthly feedings, and you can even do every 2-week feedings. What you'll see with feeding it a little bit at a time more frequently, you'll see a more consistent color throughout the year of green without pushing too much growth with a lot of nitrogen. So when you're doing these low dose feedings, it might be around a quarter pound of N at a time. You can continue to put down your heavy rates of potassium and phosphorus in a granular form to build your soil balance up without pushing all the growth that you'll give it from the nitrogen. With the lower doses of nitrogen, you're giving the turf a chance to use the nitrogen as opposed to potentially leaching out through the soil. The same results could be achieved using a controlled release fertilizer. Just some final thoughts on the CEC value. There's not really a good or bad CEC value. You just have to understand what you have and understand how it applies to your soil fertility program. These next few columns represent your percent base saturation values, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sodium, and hydrogen, and those go into your CEC number. They don't always add up to 100%. This chart will show you some acceptable percentages of each ion. There tends to be a wide range of acceptable percentages in the real world. I wouldn't get too hung up on the percent base saturation ratios and the calcium to magnesium ratios. I would try my best to get my soil balanced and my nutrient deficiencies corrected and see where everything else failed. And then if you had a severe issue with your yard, then you could pursue one of the ratios to see if that would solve the issue. The organic matter percentage, which is not reported on my soil test, ties into your CEC value. As you increase organic matter, you will increase CECs, but it will take a lot of organic matter to drastically change your CECs. It's not a bad idea to try to increase your organic matter, and this can be done through simply discharging your clippings, incorporating organic fertilizers, humic acids, or compost. The main takeaway here is just not to try to chase a certain CEC number. So if we move over to that next set of columns, is under the pounds per acre available nutrient for the copper, iron, manganese, and zinc. Those are going to be your micronutrients, and I just look at the bar graph for those and showing that most of them are in the adequate range, bordering slightly low on the zinc and manganese. And we'll be putting out a lot of micronutrients with our liquid fertilizer applications about monthly during the growing season. So hopefully we'll see those numbers come up a little bit. Now that we've determined what we need based on our soil test results, we need to implement what we're going to do for the upcoming growing season. So for me, I'm going to go with the recommended 20 pounds per 1,000 square foot of lime. I plan to add 4 to 5 pounds of phosphorus per 1,000 square foot over 3 to 4 applications during the growing season in the form of a granular fertilizer. I plan to add potassium in the same manner as my phosphorus in a granular fertilizer targeting 2 pounds per 1,000. And I plan to incorporate micronutrients into all of my fertilizer applications. Well, hopefully that gave y'all a little bit of an insight on how to interpret your soil test. There's a lot of information packed in these soil tests, and it takes a little bit of an art to interpreting them, but there's a lot of helpful information on Spectrum Analytic website. You can go and check out that, and it'll tell you all about their soil testing and how they get to the results they do and the recommended rates that they give you for the year. And just remember, it's a marathon. It's definitely not going to happen over the course of one growing season. So just
keep at it, and getting your soil well balanced is going to be the best thing you can do for the health of your turf. Appreciate y'all watching.